with dying people that has the potential to be emotionally challenging. Click again, please. Next slide. So there's these givens in the healthcare system, no matter how you organize it. Click one more time. So, and if this is givens within the actual work system, one more time, please. The question is, click again. The question is, you know, is that also then a given in the educational system? Click again, please. If I stand over there, can I click myself? So how much of this is actually implemented in the educational system? Click again. So most of this, as I said, is focusing on the human side. Click again. And again. And the thing is, we focus on half of the human, right? One more time, the brain. Kind of a lot of times when you meet somebody who's not doing as you think he or she should be doing, what do you tell them? You explain what they should have done. Is that correct? Our underlying diagnosis is they didn't know. But maybe they knew, but they didn't dare to implement it. So one more time, please. So I think it's very important that we consider both sides. And Daniel Kahneman, for those of you who have read that, has a similar thought here. One of the great psychologists, system one, that we all have two systems, cognitive systems. The system one is our immediate impression, our gut feeling, our stereotypes, all of this. System one is completely indifferent to whether the impression that system one is generating is true or not, as long as it's a good story. If you see somebody that matches your stereotypes, you don't care whether they actually are the typical German, I'm German, for example, or not. You know, you have placed them in a box, they are, you know, whatever. That is what our system one does. Patients that you find repelling, you know, your emotional response to some patients, that is your system one. System two is then if you actually switch on your and think, well, just because this patient is smelly, probably should still get a good treatment, right? And that is, you know, kind of both sides, maybe the brain and the gut, that we need to consider again with looking at humans. Click again, please. And I would like to demonstrate that with a picture. For those of you with spider phobia, you should close your eyes now. And I will tell you when you can open your eyes again. So close your eyes. So looking at this guy here, observe your reaction. And looking at this thing, observe your reaction. I assume it's different reactions, slightly less positive on this side than this. Which of them kills more people? The car, right? So for those of you who have the eyes closed, we're looking at a picture of a spider in the car. Click again, please. You can open your eyes again. So I would go so far to say, if you don't consider the emotional side in the analysis of human behavior, of human action actually, and in our interventions, it's like not considering A, B, C, D, A and B in the A, B, C, D, E approach. And now you could say, hey, we're all professionals and we don't base our decisions on emotions, that's based on evidence. But this anger that comes out of the reaction already shows that there's also emotions involved. And I think it's so important that we understand that. And this is not meant in a therapeutic way. If you are having, for example, team conflicts, then I would not necessarily care around making you a better team, but I would care about that the anger of the conflict prevents the information flow within the team that is relevant to treat the patient. And you never have done that, not telling one of your colleagues all the information you had because you didn't like that colleague. Never. You never kind of treated a patient differently because it was uncomfortable to be with this patient. Never. I know somebody who knows somebody who has seen that. But I think it's so important. Again, if you base, most of you are clinicians, you work with the notion of you have to have the right diagnosis before you implement the treatment, right? If we don't consider the emotional aspects, your diagnoses are incomplete. And I think that's very important to consider. Next slide, please. The other dimension I think that we should consider is our bodies, right? You need your ears, you need your eyes, your hands to perceive a lot of things, and you need to also to implement them. Click again, please. And, you know, when we think about bodies, it's probably a lot, you know, kind of what can we do with our bodies? That's my daughter just also to show off a little bit. Kind of, you know, what kind of movements can we do with our bodies? That is easy to see. You know, what kind of maneuvers do you do with your hands and so on? If you click one more time. But, you know, where do our bodies come in our situation awareness? And I'll come back to this concept later. For those of you who have been walking through a tunnel like this or through the night, it's a bodily sensation of not being comfortable here, right? And probably also in many of your healthcare settings, you feel it in your body. It's not a matter of brain, your body knows. And I think it's something that we should consider more also in the training. Then there is the heart, is relationships. Workplaces can be too little, can also be too much, maybe sometimes for good patient treatment. And I would argue they come in all shapes and forms and so on. So it's also a dimension, if you click again, please, that we should consider. And also maybe a spiritual dimension, our soul. It's also my daughter just that you also see her like this. You know, kind of, it's also an important dimension. How do we implement that? Can we work with this? Is there space in our simulation activities for this? Maybe not, because you think, well, that's not in my intensive care book, but maybe it's actually relevant for the treatment of patients. So I would argue if we work with people, and believe it or not, also clinicians are people, we have the professional side and the private sides. And again, maybe, you know, the border between them is probably less strict than we sometimes think. I don't really believe that you can be completely professional and leave your private side at home. And I actually don't think you should. We are human beings. Like Len said, you know, one of the consequences is, for example, that we will make error and that we will suffer from our errors, for example. Click again, please. So, and when we look at this suffering, burnout, you know, there is a 50% of critical care clinicians here say they have suffered from burnout. One more time, suicide rates with female healthcare professionals are higher than in other occupations, for example. One more time. So I think, you know, it's a relevant issue, not only for patient safety, and I think COVID showed that nicely, but also for the healthcare of health professionals. You never drank too much wine or beer or tequila when you got home from your shifts, but many people do to relax from the stressful conditions. And I think, again, I would come back to, if it's a given, if these emotional challenges are a given, then we should teach people from day one, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with the emotional challenges? What helps you? And that is super individually. It can be a walk, can be a meditation, can be a conversation, can be whatever, right? And I think, so what I would like to summarize here in between, I said, I think we can do more with simulation. So I think we can help patients, their relatives. I start one more time. We can help healthcare professionals to help patients keep the system running and so on. That is the traditional view. That is why we do simulation. We can also use simulation to actually keep healthcare professionals healthy. And if your countries is like ours, we have a serious problems, for example, with keeping nurses on the job. And I think simulation can have a role here to understand why is that, how can we create conditions that is more attractive for these professionals to stay in the game. So, and I think with simulation, we have the possibility to create the experiences and then also the reflections that would help to kind of set the focus also on these issues. And I have to decide. One way of conceptualizing this is to move it out from the personal space into the professional space. Let me check a hypothesis. So in most settings where I asked this before, how did you learn to deal with the emotions in your job? Typically what people say, well, there was a colleague who took me under his or her arm. We have a good functioning coffee place in our department. That is where you can talk about things. Basically, most of you found their own way somehow. Somehow easier, some harder. So it's basically in your personal space. If you get stressed on your job, it's your responsibility to take a mindfulness class after your long shifts in order to survive. If you have a challenge, it's very often that people say, hey, we maybe, you know, help you with extra training or so on, but you have to basically fix it. And I think it's about time that we say, well, if it's a given that you have these emotional challenges, and if this is a necessary part for the diagnosis and treatment of patients, then you should learn how to do this. And a conversation like this here, or a presentation, is maybe a part on this. But I think from day one, really, you should learn how to deal with this. Maybe also find out that is actually not my job. This is too stressful for me. And maybe you find out earlier than, you know, after many years of studies, it's maybe easier to shift them also. And I think we need to develop formats how we actually can do this. I don't have good ideas of how you can actually make this happen in practice, but I think that is, you know, why all the creative minds coming together. What kind of scenarios can you design to make this happen? How can we also from our institution, you see all these individuals struggling, feed back to the organizations and say, hey, many of them have challenges. We need to provide extra activities for them, for example. And I'm not alone with this idea. You also find it in many of the competencies frameworks. I don't go into all the details here. The Canadian model, the candidates roles, the 7 roles, for example, they have, and now you even get a bit of Danish teaching here, the professional. If you look into the description of this role, you find something like that. It's your responsibility to stay healthy enough to treat others. But again, you know, how are you helped in this regard? So in principle, it's in these frameworks. Click one more time, please. So what does that mean for simulation? How can we reduce stress, burnout, suicide potentially? One more time. And I would like to read you a quotation from an interview study with young doctors, where we looked into the issue of second victim. When you commit an error, the patient is the first victim, but you as the one who was in the error becomes the second victim because you feel very bad with this. In this, thank you. In this context, we have this interview here. So young physician. I was in a clinical rotation 8th semester in an operation room with an anesthesiologist. She asked me if I want to place the IV line. I say yes, but you have to look me over the shoulder. And she gets annoyed and says, no, I don't want to do that. I don't have time. I take charge. And I just thought, I will never do this again. Sounds familiar? And then I'm here with her another day and she asks, have you learned to place an IV yet? And in that moment, I felt I wasn't able to do it. It was like 50-50 with IVs, but I choose to say yes, because I was so tired of getting caught as the one who cannot do it all the time. And every time I say I need help, I'm met with, you are a burden. So I say yes, and totally fuck it up, of course, and she gets mad with me. So we see a young physician here who is honest about his or her abilities. And what does he or she get? Let's assume it's a man here for make it easier. What does he get? How stupid are you that you cannot do this? Is that helpful for patients? Not really. So I think from this experience, this is work as done, right? This is how supervision is done in practice. Not all the time. There's many of you who are really good in supervision and would not say this, but maybe also you have a bad day sometime and so on. And I can also come back to the anesthesiologist's perspective in a moment. If you click again. So I think would be an interesting learning goal to say, you know, how do you process that your colleagues see you as a burden? I think could be an interesting learning goal and an interesting debriefing conversation. One more time. How are you able to assess your own abilities in a system that punishes you for being honest about your weaknesses? We all have strengths and weaknesses, also the superheroes. The highest decorated chiefs of the departments, they also have weaknesses. But we are trained to hide all of our weaknesses all the time. No, don't do that. In so many regards, right? Our hero stories, it's not the people who screwed up. It's maybe the underdog, but the underdog is getting up then also to the light and so on. We don't really talk about the weaknesses, but they are relevant for patient treatment. So how do you actually learn to assess your own ability in a system that sees being honest about your weakness as a weakness in itself? Next one. The anesthesiologist's perspective is also easy to say, she should have interacted differently with the student. But I guess also those of you having students, you probably can feel yourself very much into that role as well. And like, yeah, if you're super busy and so on. So, you know, also working with supervisors then, how can you help these people? How can you tone your own voice and so on to actually help them? And we all get in situations where you shout at people and, you know, in stressful things. But maybe you can then later go and say, hey, sorry, I was also stressed. You know, this basic human interaction could be interesting learning goals. Making a difference in your system. A lot of the work that we are doing is seeing that we as human beings, we do our work, click one more time, and we solve a lot of problems. We make errors, but we also correct most of our errors. One more time, some of the errors are or problems are so large that we need help from other colleagues. That is, I think, the bulk of where we are working our simulations today. Team training, individual training, and so on. One more time, please. But some of the problems you could ask, why do we have to deal with this all the time? When you look into the literature, an interesting example, 2 milliliter syringes is empty in your intensive care room. What do? Go next room, borrow some syringes, problem fixed. You would not ask your organization who is actually responsible for filling in my 2 milliliter syringes. Doesn't really matter, it's too much work and so on. But there might sometimes be cases where you have problems that if you would buy a different machine, a different set of medication, whatever, if you would make an organizational change, click one more time, please, you could go away from problem solving to organizational change. And here's, I think, actually where we sometimes, because we are good, create problems. We are so good in helping people problem solve that they don't escalate it up to the organizations. And I think it would be interesting to also in a debriefing, for example, discuss, you know, what could you do? What could you do as a team? And what of this is relevant for your organization? And not only, you know, complaining, we don't have enough resources and our bosses are stupid and stuff, but to say, okay, what is the next step that you actually get the resources that you need? And it will take a long time, but what is the first step in this? So I think in debriefings would be interesting. How can you do with this problem here and now? But how can you here and now start the journey to make the organization change? Would be quite interesting to also explore the barriers here. I don't have time for that, so let's go on. So we had anthropology students in our center, and they came up with a, I think, pretty cool question. Are you actually training people to function in the organizations, in the jobs? Or are you training them to constructively challenging the organizations? For those of you who train young people in being assertive team members, do you do that? Good communication. The people that your trainees will meet later in clinic, are they happy that you trained them in being assertive? Not all of them. Let's maybe put it this way, right? And what do you then do? You come out of the training, you have learned your nice communication tool, and you apply that with the consultant. The consultant says, cut the crap, just give me the facts. What do you do then? You never try again. Or you say, hey, consultant, I learned something, we need to talk differently. You know, or how do we actually support people in this? Would be interesting learning goal in itself. Click one more time. So possible learning goal, how can you convince your leader that it's at least worth considering your idea? He or she doesn't have to agree, but at least should consider your idea. How can you do that? Next slide, please. Words versus concepts, one more time. Would you trust a 3-day seminar cardiologist? For those of you working with human factors issues or simulation, how long were your trainings? Typical facilitator course is 3 days, and then you will learn a lot on the job, right? The complexity of the words that we are using, one more time, please, is pretty high. Have you ever said the sentence, you were not situationally aware? Or did you hear that maybe? What happens if you lose your situation awareness? You are either asleep, and even if you sleep, you have some situation awareness. So basically you are dead if you lose your situation awareness. And maybe then we could even argue, coming back to the philosophical scale here, maybe there's still some situation awareness. Let's discuss that over a beer. So you cannot lose your situation awareness. What we're actually saying with this sentence is that you did not look at that element in the situation that I think you should have looked at. And I know that because I designed the scenario. Or I know that now because I know the results of the situation. So I think it's important that we also, fine-tune our faculty, that they actually are clear around the concepts that you talk about. Teamwork, decision-making, situation awareness. This is pretty heavy stuff. It's not like, in German we have the expression of kitchen psychology. Maybe the equivalent could be the OR human factor, I don't know. So, I think there's a high complexity in the concept that we work with, and I think we need to learn around it. And I can only highly, highly recommend this podcast series here. I don't get any royalties. I don't really know them, but it's a brilliant series, 100 episodes by now. It's really, really nice to look at that. Work of safety of work. Click one more time. So possible learning goal, maybe also, for example, to understand how is your body involved in situation awareness. Or, and I like that one, please describe to me how the concept of situation awareness can actually decrease patient safety. And if you're interested in the answer to this, you have to read Sidney Dekker, who challenges the very notion of situation awareness. Very interesting. This is a cliffhanger. I only give you the question, no results. Sustainability. I think we need to start thinking about this. You're way too warm autumn here. Our way too warm autumn. We need to get going to think about this in everything that we do. Do you know your hospital pays for these containers? Do you know how much? Or by what system? Some not, many don't. They are weighted. The heavier they are, the more your hospital pays. And you don't have to raise your hand really. Who has just saline into that, empty syringes? That's not that's not the most sustainable way of using resources, right? And I think would be quite interesting in looking also in the small details. Modify strategies that could help to reduce the resources that you're using on your job. Could also be quite interesting. Next one, please. So to summarize, One more time, please. I think in the end, we are all here because we want to make a difference for patients. We are social creatures, we are social animals, I would go so far, and we try to avoid this situation often. Every one of us has a few people that we really would like to relate to, and it would be difficult, hard for us if they say, go away. We are quite happy not to be part of every group, but some groups we all want to belong to. And we do many things to avoid this situation. Let me give you the example of a medical student. Let's call her Louise. She is on a clinical rotation with a consultant in something specialty, doesn't matter. Consultant puts on gloves, thank you, on several layers of jewelry, looking at Louise and says, hey, you didn't see that, right? What is Louise now to do? Dear Mr., Mrs., you have to sign my paper later, and I will follow you all afternoon. I think hygiene-wise, that was not smart. Or does Louise not say anything? And I think you all can relate to not saying anything. If I look at this logic from Louise's eyes, it makes a lot of sense. If I change the perspective a bit, please, and look at this from the patient's eyes, one more time, and I call the patient Esther, the situation is different. For Esther, it's pretty indifferent whether Louise gets her signature and how she gets along with the consultant if she goes home with an infection from the hospital. And I think every once in a while, it might make sense in our simulation design, in our debriefings, in the discussions that we have, to think from Esther's perspective. Those participants that you might meet who do not want to do as you tell them, you probably have met some. And I think it's very important for the facilitators to find out, do I try to convince this person because I want to win this fight? Or do I want to convince this person because I think if this person changes the behavior, it will be better for us. Also, we have our private and our professional side. I think one way of becoming better facilitators is to investigate our own contributions, for example, in such conflicts. What I've been trying to explain to you is different points of view, supplementary points of view of how we can treat Esther. I'm not saying stop doing the emergency situations, practicing procedures, practicing skills and so on. But I think we can supplement that, and we should supplement that with the other elements. And many courses that I see, they go over the same thing 5 times without real progress. And I think there we could maybe change, and talk about things one time and then move on. And with this, I would like to come one more slide. Oh, thank you. So Hodges, I think, has also a nice quotation here. What we do as educators choose to emphasize drives behavior of students and colleagues. So it's really worthwhile to pay attention to also what are we telling people with our words, but also with our actions. Are you valuable if you show weakness? Are you valuable if you are of a different profession, if you see things differently, and so on? It's one of the dimensions, for example, that we could look at. With this, I would like to thank you very much.
Con esto quisiera agradecerles. Si quisieran ponerse en contacto conmigo, aquí tienen.
Is there time for questions?
¿Tenemos tiempo para preguntas?
And is there questions?
¿Y hay preguntas?
Comments?
¿O comentarios? No sé.
No.
No, nada.
I probably won't bite. Well, if no one asks, let me know. Okay. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con lo que hablabas de situation awareness y Decker.
My question has to be with situational awareness. For me, it's extremely interesting that it's something that we live as facilitator. ¿Está usando el micrófono la pregunta? Porque casi no se oye.
Esto tiene sonido, le tienen que bajar para que no se oiga.
When we try to investigate the objectives, I tend to be counterfactual, and the perspective of the situation of what ends up happening is different. So my question would be how to manage this tension between what I want and how to achieve my objective for the learning simulation. I don't know if you understand me. What I want to say is that in the debriefing, we are doing a retrospective analysis of what happened. So if I'm going to be in their mindset, how I do this? How do I do this reflective perspective?
So I think one point is to really understand that with this hindsight bias,
que con nuestro mismo
now
sesgo,
looking back,
nobody
can assess anymore how the situation looked like for the people acting in it. Once you know the results, you can never again.
Realmente
And
no
once you know the
podemos ir
results,
hacia atrás. Pero no es que
everything
hacemos el
else or most
resultado,
of the
todo lo
things
demás
look very different.
se ve diferente.
But in the situation where the
Pero en
people
la
were, it
situación,
looked different. And I
en
think
la
as a
situación, al
debriefer,
momento de la situación,
it's
todo
interesting to try to
sería
explore how did you
entonces, como
perceive the
debriefer, tenemos
situation
que ver,
in
bueno,
this
¿cómo
case?
percibimos la
Did you see
situación
the
al estar
sign or not?
sucediendo?
No, I didn't.
Y
And
si
the more
se logró
psychological
o
safety we
no, y
have in
entre
this,
mayor
the more
seguridad
honest people will be
psicológica
in their
tengamos,
description of how they
más
saw the situation.
honestos serán los
But
demás
to
al
take for
mostrarnos cómo ellos
granted,
veían la
also, you know,
situación.
I often sit
Y
also
yo muchas
in
veces
courses think I could have
en
done it
varios
better.
cursos
I have
puedo
no clue
decir,
because I was not
podría
in the
haberlo hecho
situation.
mejor,
I
la
will
verdad
never.
en la situación no tenía idea.
So I think that's important. I'm not sure I am
Así
answering your
que creo
question,
que,
but
no sé si
it's a
estoy
complex
contestando su
concept.
pregunta, pero creo
But
que es
this
un concepto
hindsight
muy
bias, I think
complejo.
it's
Pero hay que
extremely important in
recordar
this.
que tenemos un sesgo importante.
Can we get the microphone here?
¿Podríamos darle el micrófono, por favor?
You hear me? Vielen Dank for your presentation.
Gracias por la presentación.
Okay, if I ask you in English, so I
¿Puedo hacerlo en inglés?
Yeah, if you ask in English, then I take off the headset.
Sí, sí, no hay ningún problema, nada más me quito los audífonos. Nos estamos preguntando, porque estamos de acuerdo en cuanto a muchos aspectos.
Hola, hola.
It works in Spanish.
Sí, funciona en español.
well, we agree with most of things you have
Estamos
shown.
de acuerdo con lo que nos han mostrado,
For example,
pero el problema de esta institución es que no podemos agregarlo a nuestro temario porque nuestro profesorado piensan que es la forma incorrecta de hacer las cosas. Entonces me gustaría saber cómo suelen implementarlo en las universidades. Muy buena pregunta.
I think one step is also to seeing the situation
Creo
from the
que
others.
es primero ver la perspectiva desde ese punto de vista. Ellos son
Who have been
expertos
working
que
very
han
hard
estado
on this expert
trabajando
status in a
como
certain logic.
expertos con una cierta
Be the
lógica
best,
durante un
publish or
largo
perish,
periodo.
you know,
Han
never
tenido
show
las
weakness
mejores
and so on.
publicaciones, nunca han mostrado sus debilidades, etc.
And they have built their careers on
Ellos han creado toda su
They
carrera
have
con
a slide
esta
set.
mentalidad. Y ellos
They
tienen
can
esta
give very
mentalidad
good
que
sometimes
puede
boring
ser muy buena,
lectures.
tal vez dan
They know what to
dan
do.
lecciones muy
And now
aburridas,
we come with a method
pero ahora venimos
where you
con un
say, hey, you
método
need a
y le decimos,
facilitator
oye,
course before
queremos
you
ser facilitadores.
deal with my students. And it's not actually an instructor
Y
course,
no
but a
es un
facilitator
curso
course.
como instructor, sino
So you
como
bring them in a
facilitador.
situation where they
Entonces
are
los traes a una
novices
situación
again.
donde son nuevos otra
So
vez.
no wonder that many people do not
Así
really
que,
like to change
con
because we
razón,
ask them.
muchas personas no lo quieren porque les
I think
pedimos
that is
mucho en
important to
este cambio.
take as a
Y
starting
creo
point.
que es muy
Then
importante
it's often the argument, hey, show me
llevarlos
the
a este
evidence
punto
that
de
it works.
inicio. O dicen, ok,
The evidence is
muéstrame la
out there. I
evidencia que
can
esto
name you a
funciona.
few
La evidencia
studies
está
where you
ahí.
can show
Yo puedo
simulation has
mencionar todos los
clinical outcome
estudios donde
effects.
la situación tiene
Death
resultados
rates in newborns,
clínicos
total
importantes,
needle time in stroke
las
patients.
muertes de recién nacidos,
Many
los resultados
studies
para
here.
pacientes con derrames
The
cerebrales,
question
etcétera.
for evidence
Todos los
is
estudios
often
están
not
ahí.
a question for
La
evidence,
pregunta
but a defensive
para
mechanism
solicitando evidencia no es
in order
realmente eso, es un
to keep this
mecanismo de
event.
defensa para mantener esto lejos
If
de
you then
ellos.
say, okay, if that is the
Si
starting point,
entonces
what we all
decimos,
need to do as
ok, vamos a empezar
simulation
aquí,
community is to
creo
work more
que
together.
tenemos que hacer, como
I think
comunidad
in
de
many
simulación, tenemos que trabajar
settings, in
juntos.
many countries, it's more like
En muchos
my
países es
scenario,
más como
I don't share
mi
that with you because my
escenario
students
no lo
don't
comparto
work in it.
contigo porque
Or,
yo
you know,
trabajo mucho
I
en él
have this
y
activity here
yo
and I
tengo
don't
esta
share it with
actividad y
you.
no te la voy a compartir.
And that creates a
Y creo
situation
que
where you
eso
have
crea una
many
situación
small
donde tenemos
players
muchos
who
pequeños
locally are
jugadores
large, but together are
que
small. And
juntos
they will never have
son
the
poquitos
impact
que
to
nunca
make
van
the
a tener el
curricular
impacto
changes
para
that
hacer
are
los
needed.
cambios en los
If you
temarios que
don't
se
get
necesitan.
simulation into
Si
the
no
curriculum,
logramos que
it's
la
always
simulación
with the
entre a los
amateur,
temarios,
amateurs.
siempre
You know,
vamos
you
a
have to find
ser
the time, you know,
amateurs
after you work, the
y,
students have to find
y los
the
estudiantes
time
van a
and so
tener que
on and
encontrar
so
el
on.
tiempo
And I think if you
para
really want to
hacerlo.
make these
Así que si
changes,
realmente queremos
we need
hacer
to
estos cambios,
work together and try to
necesitamos
find out
trabajar
what are the
juntos.
stakeholders that we need to convince,
Y tenemos que
what is
tomar en
the
cuenta cuáles
evidence that
son
they
o
would
quiénes son las
listen
personas
to,
a las que
and
tenemos que
how can we
convencer y
all
cómo es
work
que
together
nosotros
to
podemos
convince.
trabajar todos juntos para que
I
todo
once heard the
funcione.
sentence, you know,
Ahora,
if you have a limited
no
bucket, you
sé
can
si
try
ustedes
to
tienen
make your
limitaciones,
individual
tal
piece
vez
of
pueden
the
juntar todas las
cake
piezas
bigger,
individuales de este
or you
pastel
try
para
to
que sea un
collaborate to make a
pasteloto
bigger cake.
enorme
And I think
y
we need to find these
contribuir
bigger
a que
cake
sea grande
strategies when we
y
want to
encontrar
work
todas estas
with it.
estrategias
I
para
think
hacerlo
that
más
is
grande nos puede ayudar
where the
a
Danes were
colaborar.
good. Again,
Yo
I'm from
creo que
Germany.
los daneses
I
son muy
talk about
buenos
the
y
Danes because they did that.
ellos
And
lo
Denmark was the
hicieron.
first country to get
Ellos fueron los
simulation as a
primeros que
mandatory part
pusieron
into the
la
curriculum.
simulación como parte
There's
obligatoria
also
en su
lots of
currículum.
competition and so on, and not
Y
everybody likes everybody.
la verdad es
But
que no a
they
todo el
saw
mundo le
that,
caía bien todo
you
el
know, if you want
mundo,
to
pero
really have
si
an
realmente
impact, you need to
queremos
work
tener un
together.
impacto, tenemos que juntar nuestros esfuerzos,
Understand
trabajar
your
juntos
stakeholders.
y entender quiénes son las personas involucradas.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Muy buen día. Quisiera preguntarle, ¿qué hace
Thank you, doctor. Good morning. I would like to ask you,
en el pregrado y el posgrado?
in pre-grade and postgraduate studies, what do you do in order to favor the emotional well-being of our students with simulation? Because honestly, having that intent is really good for the programs, but I would like to know, how do you implement it?
This specific thing we don't do.
Bueno,
in,
algo que
simulation,
nosotros
we
no
do it in a
hacemos
workshop,
específicamente en la simulación, hacemos en
where
un
we
taller
present a case
donde
of second
presentamos un
victim
caso de la segunda víctima.
experiences,
Es una experiencia de segunda víctima.
and then we ask the
Y nosotros les
students,
preguntamos a los
how
diferentes
can you
estudiantes,
recognize this
¿puede reconocer
experience?
esta
We
experiencia?
also asked two
También
young
les pedimos
physicians
también a
to
los
tell
jóvenes
in a short
médicos
video clip
y les
about
mostramos
their
un
own
video
experience,
para que ellos nos
where they
digan
were
su propia
involved in
experiencia cuando
errors
se ven
or in
involucrados en un
situations where they
error o en una
afterwards said
situación
that was
que
horrible what I did.
tienen
So they see
resultados
also
horribles, de tal
the
manera que también ven un
And then
poco
we
de
also
juego de
show them
roles.
the
Y también
nurses,
les mostramos,
you know, this
sobre todo
Antonovsky
a
model.
las
Anybody know
enfermeras, están
that?
familiarizadas
You know,
con el
how do
modelo de
you stay
Antonovsky.
healthy? There's
¿Cómo
an
mantenerte
interesting model.
saludable?
Antonovsky is a name that you want
Antonovsky,
to look up.
realmente
Can you
búsquelo
understand the
para
situation?
entender la
How
situación.
can you
¿Cómo es que
affect
puedes
it?
afectarla?
What is the last one? I forgot. There's 3 dimensions.
Y perdónenme, se me olvidó la
That
tercera
actually
dimensión,
help
pero
you
son
to
3.
cope with the
Pero la
situation.
cuestión es cómo tú puedes lidiar
To
con una
talk with
situación
them
así.
also about the
Y
phases
hablar
of the
también
second
acerca de las
victim
fases de la
experience. There's a lot
experiencia
of
de la
research
segunda
around this.
víctima. También
And
hay
for
mucha
them just
investigación
to
al
see,
respecto. Y el que ellos tan solo vean, no
other
soy el
people like
único,
this,
hay otras
even the
personas allá
physicians
afuera
talk
como
about
yo,
this,
incluso los
huge
médicos
impact.
hablan al respecto. Bueno, eso hace un gran impacto, un cambio.
De nada.
Hi, Peter.
Hola, Peter. Gracias por su presentación. Tengo una pregunta. A veces la idea de la simulación es crear un ambiente seguro para los estudiantes y compartan sus sentimientos, sus miedos, sus debilidades, pero cuando salen al medio ambiente clínico, tienen esta barrera enorme. Y esa es la realidad, ¿no? Ellos tienen que vivir en esa realidad. Así que, ¿cuáles son las estrategias o cuáles son las ideas como para tomar cierta acción al respecto?
I think
Bueno,
to talk about
yo
this,
considero que hablarlo.
I think to talk about this honestly,
Estamos hablando de manera
the stuff
honesta.
that we have been
El
talking about in
personal
the
con el
course
que
here,
nosotros hemos estado
if you go back to the
hablando,
clinical
si ustedes
practice,
regresan a las
there's a high
prácticas
chance
clínicas,
that you meet this
seguramente
gray wall.
tendrán mucha oportunidad
And what can you
de
do
encontrarse
then?
con estas barreras.
Let's
Y bueno, entonces,
discuss
¿qué vas a
that.
hacer? Bueno,
What is your
hablemoslo.
experience? What is your
¿Cómo
experience?
lo
Let's put
vives?
our ideas together.
Pongamos
And we
nuestras
will not, you
cabezas
will
a
not
trabajar
change the
juntas.
healthcare system.
Obviamente no vas a cambiar el
No,
sistema
nobody will.
de
But
salud
you are,
para el día de
let's
mañana.
say something like standing
No,
on the shoulder
pero
of giants.
tú solamente
Be some of the
eres como
giants
una
later
borrita
on which the other people
al lado
will
de
stand.
gigantes, pero si todos
You
nos
make a small
juntamos, vamos a
contribution
hacer una
to
contribución más
tear down
grande,
these walls,
como para hacer que esta barrera
and to actually
caiga
make it a relevant
y realmente hacer
what
que
I
valga
think
la
is an
pena.
important
Lo que yo sí creo que es muy
line
importante
of argumentation
en cuanto a
is
los
it's
argumentos
not-
que podemos dar es que
it's not necessarily that you talk about
no se
the
trata de
well-being
solamente de
side
hablar
of
de
things, of the
la
emotions.
parte de las emociones y el
they are very
bienestar
important.
únicamente. Yo
But
creo que
if
sí
you
son
want
muy
to work
importantes,
with
pero
this
si tú
gray
quieres
wall,
trabajar con
I think
estos
it's better to go
retos,
with
con estas
this,
paredes,
you missing parts of your
tenemos
diagnosis
que decir, bueno, nos
in
faltan
understanding
partes del
human behavior if
diagnóstico
you
porque
don't
no estamos
consider these
entendiendo
issues.
el comportamiento humano.
If you look
Y
into the literature, if you're
si
scared
no
of
tomamos
something,
estas
you will spend less
cuestiones
time
en
thinking
cuenta,
about it
entonces
if you have the chance.
no
You
vamos a
will
tomar
consider
todo.
less options.
Necesitamos a tener menos,
You will try
necesitamos
out
tener más
less,
opciones. Y si no lo vemos, vamos
less
a
options in practice.
tener menos
All
opciones
of
en la
this, there is
práctica.
evidence for this,
Y hay
that
evidencia
emotions
al
have an
respecto.
impact on
Las
actions,
emociones tienen
and
un
actions
impacto en
have
las
an impact
acciones
on
y las
the
acciones
treatment.
tienen un impacto sobre el tratamiento del
So I
paciente.
think,
Así
again,
que
I think both sides are important.
yo creo
The
que ambos
well-being of
lados son
people is super
importantes.
important, but for this
Sí,
specific argument,
es
it's
muy
probably good to kind
importante
of
el
keep
bienestar
that
de
a
las
little bit
personas, pero
aside for
también
now.
tenemos que tener un ojo en el otro lado.
Sé que hay varias preguntas, pero
I know that there are several questions. I know that there are several questions, but because of due time constraints, we have to wrap up this conference. I know that we could talk 4 hours with Peter, and I hope that if you have any questions or comments, or if you have the time to discuss it later on, you can approach to Peter. Peter, we have a ton of questions in the Zoom chat, and of course we're going to give them to you already translated, so you can interact with the virtual participants. Once again, I would like to thank you on behalf of the university, on behalf of SIMex, for participating in this event. As always, we are learning from all the teachers and from all the different conferences. So Peter, thank you very much for participating.
es que es una regla del cubrebocas, pero
Well, I know that the mask is kind of the rule of thumb here, but I would like to take the picture without it. So thank you very much to everyone.